Hey there, art nerds! Your favorite watercolor artist is back at you today with another watercolor paper review. Now, for those of you who are new to the channel, hi, I'm Becca. I'm a watercolor comic artist, and when I'm reviewing watercolor paper, I'm looking for specific traits that are really ideal for comics and for illustration. Typically, I paint my comic pages on Canson Montval, which is a cellulose paper, but I love painting beautiful watercolor illustrations on cotton rag paper and have tried several over the years. I've shared my reviews here on the channel as well as over on my blog at natosoup.blogspot.com. If you'd like to check out my art, you can check it out at instagram.com/BeccaHilburn. Instagram.com/natosoup. Woo! I don't know what I was thinking. So anyway, today we're taking a look at the Schut Noblesse, and this is a paper that comes from Holland. It's a cotton rag paper. There's 10 sheets in this block, 140 pound, and this is a cold press paper. I'm not 100% sure where I bought this from. I'm thinking David's Art Supply in Metairie, Louisiana, but David's usually has a price sticker, nor am I sure what I paid at the time. I purchased it in either 2018 or 2019, and I'm so glad to be able to review it for you guys today. It means I'm making progress on my backlog. So, according to the packaging, Schut is making excellent qualities of paper since 1618 in a very traditional way. All the papers of Schut are acid-free and neutrally sized. The watercolor papers are also recommended for acrylics, gouache, soft or oil pastels. Schut Noblesse is an acid-free off-white watercolor paper made from 100% pure cotton. This absolute top-quality watercolor paper is mold-made, gelatin-sized, available in medium fine, CP, and a matte surface, HP. Everything you would expect from a paper of this quality. And Schut was established in 1618 and is located in Holland. Now, in the past, I used to like to dive into company histories, and maybe if I revisit this over on the blog, we can dive into that together. But I just want to talk about the paper here with you guys today. So there's some information on the back of the block. It's information about what this paper is good for. I'm sorry, I went and grabbed the block so I could actually tell you guys what it says. And they actually have several different blocks available. They have Serene, Ambiance, Flamboyant, and Noblesse. And Noblesse is the one we're taking a look at today. And the different dots indicate what weight the blocks come in, as well as how many sheets are in this block. So since we're taking a look at Noblesse, it's available in 95 pounds as well as 140 pounds, and we're looking at the 140 pound today. And it's available in sizes of, well, it says, oh, that's the sheets. Okay, so the sheets are also available in 95 and 140. I'm sorry, that graph is not that easy to read. And the blocks are available in different sizes, 7 by 9 by 5, 9.5 by 11.75, 11.75 by 15.75, and 15.75 by 19.75. And today, we're taking a look at the 9.5 by 11.75 in the 140 pound paper. So I think it's a little bit sad that there's only 10 sheets on this block. I'm used to blocks that have like 15 to 20 sheets. Now, I will say this is a little bit of a rarity. When I was trying to find just sales information about this block, I found a lot of blogs that were like, I'd like to try this paper, but I can't find this paper. It's not available through Blick as a block, but the individual sheets are $6.51, and I'll have that down in the description below, as well as a transcript of what we talked about today. The Blick listing mentions a proprietary gelatin sizing process that delivers extraordinarily brilliant colors. It also says this is best suited for experienced artists as its surface treatment makes corrections difficult. Armadillo Art does offer it, but it doesn't list a price, which is pretty unusual. And Amazon carries a listing for the block, but it's unavailable and a price isn't listed. So this is kind of a difficult paper to track down. I avoided reading other people's reviews before reviewing this paper so as not to prejudice myself. I do have a lot of watercolor experience, but I'm not sure I'm what they would call an experienced artist since, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I make watercolor comics. I don't consider myself a fine art watercolor artist. So for today's test, we're going to do do 3 layers on this paper, and we're going to try to make some mud. And I'm using the Daniel Smith Ultimate Mixing Palette. This is their half pan palette because this is a palette that has a lot of really granulating colors, and I figure if anything's going to make mud on this paper, this is going to be it. Now, Nada Art does have it available in the same size for $19.49, so if you can find it, it's not actually that expensive of a paper. This block is bound on all 4 sides, and it's similar binding to what Fluid or Stonehenge uses, and there's no protective front sheet. I found that this is a warm white paper with a moderate amount of texture to the surface. It doesn't seem to have a lot of surface sizing. It's probably similar in handling to Fluid 100, and my camera has a heck of a time focusing on this paper because it's so white, so I do apologize. So the first thing I did is I really saturated this paper with a lot of water, and now I'm just dabbing on saturated color. So to test this, to make some mud, I'm going to saturate the paper heavily. I'm going to do multiple layers, and I'm going to check for buckling, kipping, lifting, and mud. I'm also checking for color vibrancy once dry, and I'm checking for wet into wet workability. So I noticed with this first layer that is some slight buckling in areas that are particularly drenched. The water mainly stays on the surface. It doesn't really soak into the paper. And I did 0 water control on this first layer, and that was on purpose. So this paper is just sopping wet. After a little water control, you know, mopping it up with a thirsty brush, I found the color much easier to control. On this paper, colors really do not want to move or blend from where they're put down. Some papers will take your color everywhere, and this paper, everything stays pretty local to where it is. So I also want to point out that while I was working on this test, I was also recording the tests for the Paul Rubens 100% cotton rag paper pad and the Sennelier watercolor paper pad. So it actually gave me a lot of basis for comparison and a lot of food for thought, because as soon as I did a layer with this and it was too wet to rework, I'd go bring it into another room to dry out and pop another pad down on the table. So when I say these colors really don't move, that's in comparison to the Paul Rubens pad where the colors moved a lot, and the Sennelier pad, which while small, had good color movement. With this is maybe not the best pad if you like these big, broad, atmospheric, wet into wet washes like sunrises and sunsets, or if you use wet into wet to really convey motion, because these colors are not moving all that much. But if you have difficulty with your watercolor paper kind of getting away from you, this might be a better paper for you. So you can see the color really doesn't move all that much. It bleeds out a little bit, but doesn't really go anywhere after that. So I'm going to set this paper aside and let this layer dry fully before applying the next layer. I checked on it a couple hours later and the paper had dried, so I decided to resume the test the next day since I, as I mentioned earlier, was also working on a Paul Rubens and Sennelier test at the same time. So this paper was allowed to dry overnight, and it was allowed to dry for at least 18 hours. So after allowing the paper to dry overnight, it's time to take a look at what we've got with layer 1. Again, we're still checking for buckling, kipping, if the paper has distorted or warped in any way. And we're still going to be using the same paints, the Daniel Smith mixing palette, for our second and third layers here. And I'm using a big synthetic watercolor brush that's really capable of handling a lot of water. So I noticed that the paper is flat and the paper pattern is very visible. It's fairly even, almost like linen. The paper texture is slightly more pronounced than it was on day 1. So I'm going to wet the paper down completely the same way I did last time, and what I'm looking for is color reactivation, color movement, whether or not the paper can actually hold on to the color in the pad. So at first I just doused it with water and I noticed minimal color movement and really only the dark phthalo moved much. And that was applied really liberally. So some of the sediment might still be sitting on the paper surface. It might not have had a chance to actually bond with the paper fibers. Again, I made no attempt at water control. The paper was really doused. I really just wanted to see if we could just saturate this paper and get those colors to move. So then I applied color on top of that mess, and the paper does ripple and buckle quite a bit. It could be due to this being a larger pad. As you guys probably know, as paper absorbs water, it expands a bit, and that's one of the reasons paper has a tendency to buckle, and that's one of the reasons you might want to stretch or use a block when you're painting. But color really doesn't move a whole lot on this paper. It mostly stays in the general area where it was applied. So here are some closer up shots so you can actually see the texture of the paper and how color sediments onto this paper. I moved this block into another room to allow it to dry, and I was tempted to hyperlapse the drying process, but I feel that would be a bit of a waste of time for both me and for you guys. So I checked on it 45 minutes later, and it was dry to the touch but still a bit cool, and the paper was still a bit cockled, so I let it dry longer. So the next day, here we are, day 3, the paper has again dried completely flat. I noticed that the colors seemed a bit muted considering how much pigment you guys saw me load onto the paper. And a little bit of pigment movement this time, but not too bad. Again, I'm dousing it with clean water, and then I'm going to add color on top of that. The paper definitely wants to buckle the same way every time. I've mentioned this in some of my other videos, but watercolor paper does have a memory. Typically, that refers to the first time it was stretched. If you stretch it on a really humid night and it cockles a whole lot while you're stretching it, it's probably going to cockle the same way every time you add a lot of water to it. So I was a little bit surprised that on a block, it tended to buckle the same way every time. Again, I made no attempt at water control, and I noticed that water tends to pool in the center of the paper. So when doing water control with this pad, you want to be careful not to disturb the pigment too much if you're doing water control. It kind of just sits on the surface for a while. Once the paper has had a chance to absorb the water though, colors do move a fair amount, but not as much as you'd expect from a paper that's as saturated as this one. The buckling causes colors to pool and water to stagnate, and that is something that would have to be controlled on a pad like this. You can see there in the center how the water is kind of pooled down, and that's definitely going to affect, like you can literally see how that would affect. It's like a crease in the paper. I don't know if maybe there was some damage done to the block at some time, but this is definitely something that's good to know. Now, normally when I'm painting for myself, when I'm painting illustrations, I do practice water control. I don't like leaving water just pooled on the paper, but I think it's really important when doing these paper reviews to do as thorough a test as possible. So speaking of a really thorough test, I am going to do a field test where I paint an illustration on this paper in a separate video, and I hope you guys will stick around and hopefully check that out. Speaking of, if you're new here on the channel, hi, welcome. If you enjoy my work, if you enjoy listening to me, hanging out and painting with me, it'd really mean a lot to me if you take a moment to click subscribe and hit the bell notification so YouTube lets you know when I update. If you're not new to the channel, if you've been watching my videos for a while and you enjoy them, it would also really mean a lot to me if you'd head on over to Patreon at patreon.com/nattosoup and join the art nerd community. I purchase all the materials that I review on this channel unless I disclose otherwise, but it's been a while since anybody sent me anything to review. And it does get kind of expensive. So your help on Patreon helps me to continue to do these kind of reviews and share them with you guys. So I'm just kind of dabbing in some color, checking for movement, for layering, for granulation. You see me splattering the color in. We're checking for pigment dispersal. How far does it move? How quickly does it move? And of course, we're looking to see if we can make some mud. And what I'm really looking for, what I'm hoping to see, I'm hoping not to see mud. What I'm hoping to see is good color clarity, a lot of optical blending, that we can, for granulating colors, we can see the granulation. For non-granulating colors, they don't tend to settle in areas where they shouldn't. I'm hoping to not see the colors lift up and reactivate. I'm looking for a paper that can take a lot of water and can take a lot of layers. So after I made a kind of pretty mess, actually, it looks a bit like a sunrise here, we're going to move this to another room and allow it to dry yet again overnight. So we've done 3 layers on this paper. I want to test out masking fluid. So in the past, I've had some bad experiences with masking fluid where I use a removable masking fluid. In fact, I use this masking fluid here. And when I go to remove it from the paper, it literally rips up the paper. This is particularly true with Shizen, which is why I don't recommend you use masking fluid on Shizen. So now when I'm testing out a watercolor paper, I always test to make sure that masking fluid will work on it. So I'm using Winsor & Newton removable masking fluid, the kind with a little bit of yellow dye. I've applied it into a small dinky dip. This keeps the whole bottle from spoiling. And I'm going to use a synthetic brush that's been coated with brush soap to apply our masking fluid. And for this test, I'm just kind of doodling. I'm doing masking fluid in different sizes and different shapes. Some squiggles. We're also going to cover some larger areas as well as some really thin, fine areas and some dots. Something else I want to check is I want to see if color will seep underneath the masking fluid when I apply a whole lot of water and kind of pollute that mask. So once the masking fluid was dry, I saturated the paper with color. There was no initial wash of water first, unlike the other 3 tests, but loose washes of color on the paper. So I'm going to allow this layer to dry, and then I'm going to remove the masking fluid. So some folks can use their fingers to remove masking fluid. I just can't. I think my hands are too dry. So I'm using a masking fluid pickup. It's like also known as a rubber cement pickup. You can even find these at Dollar Tree these days. So it does take a pickup and some persistence to remove the masking fluid from this paper. Some areas do tear just a little bit. It's more like abrasion than ripping. The masking fluid is just too sticky on this paper. It really wants to adhere to the fibers of this paper. So frankly, I would not recommend using masking fluid on this paper. Now, I didn't really have any issues with colors seeping in underneath the masking fluid and kind of polluting the mask, but masking fluid is just so difficult to remove from this paper, and I find it does kind of ruin some of the color underneath just a little bit. It's not really a risk I would want to take, particularly for larger areas like with that square. It was particularly noticeable and particularly difficult to remove in areas like this. So this is definitely a use masking fluid at your own risk, but I would really recommend you don't. As you guys can see, it really takes a lot of persistence to remove the masking fluid from this paper. And you can see those little fine white specks there. Those weren't there before I applied the masking fluid. It was a pretty clean, solid application of color. So that's areas where the masking fluid pulls up bits of the paper since it's so sticky and so difficult to remove. So now we come to the final test outside the field test, removing it from the block using a palette knife. I found it very easy to remove from the block using a palette knife. So my final thoughts. This is a challenging paper to find, and that's one of the reasons I love going to David's Art and Metairie. They always have something unique or original. There's a bit of a mystique about this paper online, probably due to its limited availability, but frankly, from the mud test, I don't see anything to write home about. I wouldn't go out of my way to find this paper. And I certainly wouldn't go to a lot of effort chasing it down if you already have a paper that you love and enjoy using. This isn't going to be one of those papers I reach for time and time again. I'm going to try to use it, and maybe I'll fall in love with it during the field test, but I don't see that happening as there are already so many accessible, affordable watercolor papers that come in larger blocks that have better color movement and play nicer with masking fluid, and I don't have to chase them down, that I could just grab and use instead. Of course, like I said, there's still the field test. I might fall in love with it, or I might hate it even more. So I hope this review was helpful, useful, and informative for you guys. I really enjoyed recording and sharing it with you guys. I love playing with watercolor supplies. If you have any questions that I haven't answered here, ask me down in the comments below, and I'll certainly keep that in mind when I'm field testing this paper a little bit later on. I hope you guys found this helpful, useful, and informative, and I hope if you enjoyed this video, you'll leave a like and a comment down in the comments below, particularly, like I said, if you guys have questions. So I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you guys again really soon. Remember, keep an eye out for the field test. Bye, guys!